Thanks for clicking. The Bank of Canada is having to inject money into the banking system via the overnight repo market due to a global bond rally. This according to Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem at an appearance before the Finance Committee on Thursday. This was the first time that the governor has addressed these overnight repo operations, which began on January 3rd of this year and was picked up by the media a little over a week ago. And, as we'll see, the central bank is now facing questions by Parliament's Finance Committee.
My understanding is that the overnight repo operations are normal functions of monetary policy, and I wanted to ask you to confirm whether that's correct.
We're all fine. Everyone's fine.
As we'll see, the governor was able to confirm to the Finance Committee that overnight repo operations are in fact a part of normal monetary policy.
I won't be needing this.
But also, as we'll see, admitted that there is a liquidity problem going on in the system. So what I want to do today is go over the governor's appearance before the Finance Committee, delve into the answers he had on the overnight repo operations being conducted by the Bank of Canada since January 3rd, and then discuss some major questions that were left unanswered. As mentioned, the first overnight repo operation occurred on the 3rd. The Bank of Canada explained it via Twitter on the 12th. The media picked it up on the 24th. And as of February 2nd, Parliament appears to have taken notice. We will continue to track this story on this channel. Click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates. But for now, let's get into this appearance. Onto the repos. Very briefly, as we talked about this before, the Bank of Canada has been providing overnight loans to the banking industry, to someone in the financial sector since January 3rd, injecting rolling $5 billion repurchase loans since the beginning of this year. And, although we've talked about it at great length on this channel, when the governor was before the Finance Committee on Thursday, Gabriel Ste-Marie of the Quebecois was the first person to hold the central bank publicly accountable.
You did a lot of liquidity injections, and when was the last time that you used that tool? We know that it's a normal tool that you use. It's not used often, but why were the market's interest rates why weren't they not at the estimated level? What happened?
Yeah, for the first time since January 3rd, someone was in a position to ask the Bank of Canada a question of consequence, and in fact they used it.
How'd you do that?
The governor, for his part, went on to summarize the bank's operations.
There were 12 days in a month where we conducted repo operations. Now, the amount was not the same every day, but it was probably around $5 billion. But that's a one-day loan, so after one day it's paid back. You can't accumulate that $5 billion. And then on the last day that we did was, January 23rd, I believe? During the last week we didn't do repo operations.
So, yes, the central bank has been doing rolling overnight repurchase loans into the banking sector, meaning they lend $5 billion, it gets paid the next day. They lend another $5 billion, it gets paid the next day. And, while this is neither here nor there, as I'm sure the governor was surprised to even have this mentioned at the Finance Committee, the last overnight repo loan occurred on January 31st, one day before the governor's appearance. Regardless, the governor went on.
Repo operations are routine operations. They're standard. They do not reflect problems of financial stability. They do not indicate systemic problems. But there's a certain friction. So from time to time, we have to go and use those operations. And why do we do them? Well, it's because when we take monetary policy decisions, we set a target, and our current target is 5%. So when there is pressure, now there were increasing pressures, so our average overnight, those rates were going up higher than we wanted to see them. So there are operations that we use from time to time. Sometimes we do reverse repos, and we take deposits, not loans. Those involve deposits, not loans, rather, and that draws liquidities from the system. So I think I've answered your question. Thank you.
That's all you'll get from me.
Well, no, the governor didn't really answer the question. The question was, A, when was the last time the Bank of Canada used its overnight repo operation tool? And the answer should have been in March of 2020, according to the Bank of Canada's Twitter page. And B, the other question was what happened that required the use of an overnight repo operation, to which the governor responded, friction and it's normal.
Well, I'm satisfied.
And as we've discussed on this channel, the Bank of Canada hasn't had to inject any money into the market since March of 2020, as the banks have had ample liquidity, ample cash on hand that the Bank of Canada printed for them in March of 2020. So, something has definitely changed. Why is the Bank of Canada having to use cash injections in the overnight repo market when the banks still have $120 billion on hand? Thankfully, or not, the governor was pressed on this later on.
Understanding is that the overnight repo operations are normal functions of monetary policy, and I wanted to ask you to confirm whether that's correct. And can you just briefly explain how your other international counterparts, like the Fed in the U.S. or the European Central Bank, et cetera, how they use this tool of monetary policy?
And on this, the governor actually did answer the question that was asked prior.
Overnight repos are sort of a standard part of our operating framework. We haven't used them for some time because, really the pandemic sort of interrupted that because there was a number of extraordinary tools used. But now things are getting back more to normal, and so you're seeing us using this tool again.
So yeah, like we said, the bank did use extraordinary measures during the pandemic, meaning quantitative easing, where it printed a bunch of cash and bought up all of the government bonds from the banks. But, and here's the important part, the governor went on to address the tightness in the system, to address the lack of liquidity, lack of cash in the banking system.
We are seeing some tightness in overnight markets. There's probably more than one reason for that, but one factor, which I think is a more global factor, and we have been talking to other central banks, and they are seeing similar types of pressures. One thing you're seeing is, as you're well aware, bond rates went up quite a bit in the last couple of years. More recently, they've started to come down as market participants expect that central banks, we're winning the fight against inflation, so they're expecting we will lower interest rates. And that is spurring increased demand for those bonds because they want to buy them before interest rates come down further. That has to be funded. Some of that funding is in the overnight market, so it's creating some upward pressure. So,
a lot to unpack here. So, there it is. We've been asking on this channel multiple times why the Bank of Canada had to engage in an overnight repo operation. Was it A, that someone had bad collateral that no one wanted to lend to the financial institution, or B, was someone out of cash? And judging from the governor's answer, it's a lack of cash. Second, and the real important part for trying to understand what's going to happen in the future, is the governor's answer about the lack of cash, the lack of money in the system. The global bond rally that has investors, has banks, putting all of their money in bonds, leading to a lack of liquidity. Basically, what the governor is saying is that as investors, as banks pile into bonds, buy up all of the bonds in the market, trying to take advantage of the higher yields, there's a lack of liquidity in the system. The banks are running out of cash, and the Bank of Canada is having to step in. But this isn't the first global bond rally that we've seen over the past few years. In fact, we saw one just a year ago, when investors piled into U.S. Treasuries on the U.S. banking crisis, and the central banks weren't having to step in back then. We didn't have any repo operations in March of 2023. And the reason, of course, is that a year ago, there was still ample liquidity in the system, with the banks, the financial institutions, still having $200 billion on hand at the Bank of Canada. So, while the governor said that the Bank of Canada has had to step in because investors, because banks are putting all of their money into bonds, there is another part of that equation, ability to fund, which the banks seemingly no longer possess, though that part wasn't said out loud.
You keep your mouth shut.
Speaking of things not said, the natural follow-up to the governor's response should have been, so are we done then? Have the banks bought up all of the bonds that are available? Is there no more debt coming to the market?
There's actually a lot more.
Yeah, given that the United States is about to hold some of its largest bond auctions on record, the Canadian government is currently running a deficit and is going to need to borrow another $30 billion in the next couple of months. Will the market be able to handle this deluge of debt issuance without having to turn to the money printer for more loans? And the answer, which was not forthcoming by the governor as he hasn't been asked by anyone, is that the Bank of Canada, the central banks, will probably have to stop quantitative tightening earlier than they thought, and will have to start buying up Canadian bonds again, with all of the inflationary pressures that come with it. As we've discussed so many times before on this channel, if the governments are going to continue to issue debt, if the governments are going to continue to need to borrow money, and there's not enough money in the banking system to provide for those loans, then the central bank has to step in. Not necessarily has to, but given the experience, the central banks will step in.
That has to be funded.
But, as mentioned, questions of quantitative tightening weren't asked. Instead, Parliament moved on to ask about inflationary pressures brought on by government spending.
Again, for the sake of my constituents, but also for clarification here amongst the MPs, what are the major reasons that we have high inflation, and not just in Canada, but in many countries?
I need you to do me a favor.
Finally, the third most important takeaway from the appearance before the Finance Committee was the Deputy Governor's point that this is not just a Canadian issue, but rather a global one.
I was on a call with our colleagues from other central banks on Monday this week, and I was actually at the Fed on Tuesday, and what we're seeing happen in Canada is happening at other central banks. They're also using the equivalent to their tool, the overnight rate, for largely the same reasons that the Governor described.
So, just to be clear, these overnight repo operations caused by a lack of liquidity in the system, a lack of cash in the system, have been going on since January 3rd. Our central bank is discussing it with the Federal Reserve. The media just picked up on it a week ago, and the Finance Committee wants to know what they are.
We're all fine. Everyone's fine.
So, in summary, the Bank of Canada started those repo operations on January 3rd. It was the first time that they've had to inject money into the system since March of 2020, and Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem is finally addressing it publicly. The governor, in so many words you had to read between the lines, is admitting that there is a lack of liquidity, a lack of cash in the system, brought on, in large part, by a global bond rally, meaning too much money going into government bonds, leaving not enough money in the system to provide for overnight operations. We've talked about this at great length on this channel, looking at a lack of liquidity in the United States as government spending requires that more and more money be taken out of the market to fund U.S. fiscal deficits. However, as the governor mentioned today, this does appear to be a global issue, definitely occurring in Canada, but also globally as well, which, all things being equal, if the banks don't have the money, the central banks are going to step in, meaning a premature end to quantitative tightening and all of the inflationary pressures that come with that. As before, we will continue to track this lack of liquidity, lack of cash in the system, and the Bank of Canada's responses therefrom. Click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, thanks so much for watching.